Hello, my name is Cameron Miller, and this is Trinity Place, Geneva, New York. Thanks for being with us. I want to start with a poem by Stephen Mitchell, appropriate for today. It's titled The Parable of the Sower, which is also the gospel we read. A sower went forth to sow. Some of his seeds fell upon stony places. Centuries passed, millennia, and the seeds remained. And the stones crumbled and became good soil, and the seeds brought forth fruit. "Wait a minute," said one listener. "You can't play fast and loose that way with natural facts. The seeds would die long before the soil would receive them." "Why would they die?" "Because they can't hold out in stony places for thousands of years." "But my dear, what kind of seeds do you think we're talking about?" "But my dear, what kind of seeds do you think we're talking about?" That was the Stephen Mitchell poem. The seeds outlasted the stones, poor rocky places ground down by time to become sand in an hourglass, ground down one chip and chunk at a time by erosion, rain, wind, fire, rivers, earthquakes, and time. Always the slow procession of time. Rock ground down to sand. Rock ground down to sand. A mountain pinnacle falling in geologic slow motion for millennia into the granules of beach, then finally carried out to sea. Granite ground down to itsy bitsy grains of time. But the seed, its generations are growing ever more prodigious. Carl Sagan, the late noted astronomer, once said that human beings are like cockroaches. We survive anywhere, on rocky ground, icebergs, desert, and water. He could envision that in the aftermath of a massive nuclear catastrophe, 3 species would be left standing: cockroaches, rats, and humans. Jesus' point was a little different, but oddly it works toward the same kind of direction. I want to preface Jesus' point, however, with a brief Bible study. One of the ways that scholars attempt to discern Jesus' words or intent, original words or intent, if indeed such a thing is actually ever really possible, is to note that there are differences in the literary and spoken forms of Jesus' day. For example, Jesus taught with parables, pithy spoken sayings, well suited for someone who could not read or write, which Jesus may not have been able to do. Parables were also well suited for memorization by audiences who heard them, which was important because certainly Jesus' audiences probably could not read and write. Parables were a unique teaching tool developed by itinerant Judean and Galilean teachers during a brief period around the 1st century. On the other hand, allegory was a Greek teaching device that was widely used for hundreds of years and is still used quite frequently today. Now notice that the portion of this gospel that we use today in our service online has a parable hidden like a dinosaur bone lodged in stone. It did not include, I did not include in our reading the paragraph which was Matthew's allegorical interpretation of the parable. Because we are so familiar with allegories, they can, by contrast, help us to understand the uniqueness of parables. But they can also muck things up, which is why I left off Matthew's allegorization. But the parable tells a simple point about what God is like. One single point about what God is like. While an allegory takes each element of the story and gives each element a highly symbolic meaning. A parable has one strong point like the tip of a spear, And it makes that point with a sharp contrast or comparison. So the original parable about the kingdom of God and the sower, before it got passed around for generations and turned into an allegory, may have gone something like this. The kingdom of God is like someone who sowed good seed, and when it was discovered that weeds had grown up around the wheat, she wisely waited until the harvest before separating the two. Just that simple. The kingdom of God is like someone who's in no hurry because she understands that the nature of time and the processes of creation. The nature of time and the process of creation. There's a very juicy, even challenging meaning swimming around in that parable. The kingdom of God is like someone who allows time and the processes of creation to work on the fruit of her labor. Because you see, human beings are one of the fruits of God's labor. So what that parable might suggest is that someday, somehow, human beings may actually bear fruit. It may be a parable with hope at its point. That somehow we might actually survive long enough to find ourselves in good soil and producing the fruit of God's love for which we were created in the first place. Is that too much to hope for? Is that too Pollyannish? Well, I'll tell you why I think it's not too much to hope for. Because it's grounded in fact. Yes, it's grounded in fact, in solid, concrete, scientific evidence even. In an age of pervasive cynicism, it's difficult to believe that our little acts of kindness or our advocacy for justice can have an impact on the rest of humankind. Even more difficult for us to believe is that what we humans do and how our future unfolds could somehow positively impact the cosmos. Isn't that a stretch for this day and age? To believe that whatever happens to human beings, as tiny as we are, and as little as our planet is, swirling around at the tail end of the solar system, that we could have a positive impact on the whole cosmos? Some people roll their eyes at the idea of the butterfly effect, mostly because popular culture literalized it, and as if it literalized what was a very useful physics metaphor. It wasn't meant literally to mean that a butterfly's flutter in Brazil could create a tornado in Texas. But it did express what physics and mathematics has observed, that a small event at just the right moment, at just the right time, can trigger a whole set of events that culminate in the formation of a hurricane somewhere else in the world. We have certainly witnessed over and over and over and over again in climate science and earth studies, weather studies, how something small on one part of the planet can have terrible consequences very far away on another part of the planet. So, what about the human effect? What about the idea that something a group of people do in the little city of Geneva, New York, or anywhere for that matter, could positively impact the lives of other people somewhere else on the planet? What about the Earth effect? What about the idea that what we do on Earth, what becomes of humankind, for example, will have a ripple effect and touch the cosmos in some far distant place, across time and across space? If we've learned nothing else, from climate change, or the pandemic, or even economics. It's that everything is connected, and it is impossible for us to escape the consequences of what China and Brazil do, just as it is impossible for them to escape what the consequences of what we do here in New York. If that's true in the negative, then it must also be true in the positive. If we can recognize the extreme interconnectedness of life as a result of our environmental sins and our economic excesses and our military plundering, and then how can we not recognize that the love we share here in our lives and together, and the justice we foster here and in our lives together, and in the joy that we encounter here and in our lives together, have some kind of influence elsewhere? It's easy to feel the weight of our powerlessness under the preponderance of media images stained with pain and suffering. They assault us minute by minute, and yet there is an astounding array of other events that have life-giving influence, that work to counterbalance the darkness. What we do and our relationships with one another, what we do with our hands, what we do with our money, what we do with our knowledge, what we do with our creativity, what we do with our wisdom, all of it can have unseen effect elsewhere in the world, especially when the ingredients of time and creation are added. Who knows, perhaps maybe even elsewhere in the cosmos. We know this for a fact because that's how the creation works. Everything is interconnected. The kingdom of God, the parable says, is like someone who allows time and the processes of creation to work on the fruit of her labor. The stones crumble, create good soil, and the seeds, they finally bring forth fruit. Now here's the challenge. If your personal parable for life, for your life and for our life together, is more grim than that, if it's more pessimistic, if it's less hopeful than Jesus' image, then it's time for you to reconsider your assumptions. Frankly, it is far more energizing to assume our influence than to assume our powerlessness. And it's far more empowering to assume our positive consequences of our interconnectedness than only assume the negative. And as with most things that matter, it's truly our choice which one we will assume. The kingdom of God is like someone, maybe you, who allows time and the processes of creation to work on the fruit of her labor. Stones crumble, eventually become good soil. And the seeds, they finally bring forth fruit. Thank you for listening, and peace be with you.